November 1881, at Red Ridge Pass, Colorado. Four towering men stood shoulder to shoulder across the depot yard, their eyes cold as steel, fixed on the bounty hunter. "Take your hand off her." Gideon's voice wasn't loud, but it froze the entire station. Daltrey stumbled back, while Evangeline Mercer stood frozen, heart-pounding, with no idea her fate had just taken an entirely different turn. What brought her here, and who are the four Hawthorne brothers? Find out right now in this video. The stagecoach depot at Cottonwood smelled like horse sweat and burnt coffee, and the kind of desperation that settles into wood after decades of hard use. Evangeline Mercer stepped down from the coach with one carpetbag, a Winchester she kept slung low, and an advertisement folded 4 times in her coat pocket. Ranch housekeeper wanted, room, board, fair wages. Hawthorne Ridge, Red Ridge Pass, Colorado. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. Behind her, the Rockies cut into a steel gray November sky. Snow was falling, not heavy yet, just a whisper of it drifting through the pines. She tilted her face up for half a second and breathed in cold mountain air, sharp as a new blade. It was the first clean breath she'd taken in 3 weeks. The depot was busy in that particular frontier, way 2 freight wagons unloading, a cluster of miners heading south, a Ute woman selling smoked meat from a wooden stand near the water trough. Eva kept moving, kept her eyes open. 22 years of living under her father's roof in Virginia had taught her that the moment you relaxed was the moment something went wrong. Something went wrong almost immediately. "Miss Mercer." The voice came from her left, low, flat, and familiar in the worst possible way. She turned slowly. The man leaning against the depot post was built like a saloon door, wide, heavy, and not particularly interesting to look at. He wore a canvas duster and a United States deputy's badge that Eva was almost certain he had no legal right to carry. His name was Daltrey. She recognized him from Philadelphia. He worked for Harrison Alcott, her ex-fiancé, which meant he wasn't a real deputy. He was a collector. "Long way from Virginia," she said. "You are too." He pushed off the post and stepped into her path. "Mr. Alcott sends his regards. He's got a coach headed back east, leaving in 40 minutes. He'd like you on it. I imagine he would. This ain't a request, Miss Mercer." She didn't reach for the Winchester. Not yet. There were too many people around, and she wasn't in the business of turning a freight depot into a bloodbath, but she also wasn't getting on any coach. Not today. Not ever. "Harrison Alcott is not my husband," she said clearly. "He is not my father. He is not my employer. He has no legal claim over my person or my movements. Whatever he's paying you, it doesn't change that." Daltrey smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant thing. "What he's paying me is more than enough." He reached for her arm. A voice cut across the depot yard like an axe through green wood. "Take your hand off her." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Eva turned and she saw them for the first time. 4 men, standing in a loose line about 20 feet back, just arrived from the hitching post where 4 horses stood still, as statues. The one who'd spoken was the tallest, broad through the shoulders, wearing a long oilskin coat the color of charcoal. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been through weather, through war, through years of making hard decisions and living with them. His eyes were pale gray or light green. She couldn't tell from the distance, and they were fixed on Daltrey with a calmness that was more unsettling than rage. Behind him stood 3 others, a dark-haired, square-jawed man with the thick forearms of someone who worked iron for a living. Another, younger and rougher looking, with a jaw that needed a shave, and eyes that had seen something that hadn't left him. And the last one, the youngest, barely her own age, with a quieter face and something alert and watchful in his expression. Daltrey didn't let go of her arm, but his grip got uncertain. "This ain't your business," he said. The tall one, the one who'd spoken, walked forward. He moved without hurry. That was the thing about him. No part of his body communicated urgency, and somehow that made him more dangerous, not less. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at Daltrey the way a man looks at a problem he's already solved in his head. "It became my business," he said, "the moment you put your hand on a woman who asked you not to. She didn't ask me nothing. She told you he has no claim on her. That's the same thing." He tilted his head slightly. "Drop her arm?" Daltrey's jaw worked. He was doing the math. 4 men, all of them bigger than he was, none of them looking particularly concerned. His hand fell away from Eva's arm. She took 1 step sideways and stood her ground. She wasn't hiding behind anyone. Daltrey tried a different angle. He straightened up, put one hand near his holster, and looked the tall man in the eye. "I got a lawful contract to return this woman to her intended. A contract to return a person." The tall man said it slowly, like he was tasting every word. "You understand what you just said?" Daltrey blinked. "A woman isn't property to be claimed, tracked, or bargained for." His voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. "She's got her own mind and her own 2 feet to decide where she belongs." The depot had gone still. The miners weren't moving. The freight workers had stopped. Even the horses seemed to be listening. Daltrey looked at the 4 brothers. He looked at Eva. He looked at the tall man one more time, and something in that pale-eyed gaze apparently settled the argument for him, because he took a step back. "Alcott won't let this go," he said. "That's between him and Miss Mercer." The tall man didn't blink. "You're done here." Daltrey left. Not quickly. He had his pride, but he left. The 4 men didn't celebrate. Nobody slapped backs or grinned. The dark-haired one with the blacksmith's arms just exhaled quietly through his nose. The rough-looking younger one crossed his arms and watched Daltrey until he was out of sight. The youngest relaxed his shoulders by a fraction. The tall man turned to Eva. "Gideon Hawthorne," he said. "These are my brothers, Caleb, Jude, Bo." He nodded at each in turn. "We got your letter last week. You're the housekeeper, Evangeline Mercer." She looked him straight in the eye. "And I'd prefer to be called Eva." Eva. He accepted that without comment. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She was, a little shaken. But she'd learned young not to let that show in her face. "Thank you for the intervention." "Wasn't charity," Gideon said. "It was just right." She studied him for a moment. Then she studied the other 3. Caleb the blacksmith gave her a brief, calm nod. Nothing performative about it. Jude had a hard face, the kind that didn't give much away, but he'd positioned himself between her and the direction Daltrey had gone. Unconsciously, maybe. Maybe not. Bo just met her eyes and then looked away, like he understood he was the youngest, and it wasn't his place to say much yet. 4 enormous mountain men, any one of whom could have snapped Daltrey in half. Not one of them had drawn a weapon. Not one had raised his voice above a firm conversation. Gideon had stood in that bounty hunter's way with nothing but the truth and the absolute certainty that he meant every word of it, and it had been enough. Eva filed that away. "Horses ready?" she asked. "Ready," Bo said. First word he'd spoken. His voice was younger than the others, but steady. She adjusted the strap of her carpetbag. The snow was coming down a little heavier now, catching in the pine boughs above the depot, turning the air white and soft and quiet. Behind her, Virginia felt like another lifetime. In front of her, the mountains rose up cold and enormous and real. She walked to the horses. Gideon fell into step beside her, not in front of her, and she noticed that. The other 3 spread out naturally, nobody jostling for position, nobody performing for her benefit. Just 4 men and a woman heading for the same destination. Red Ridge Pass opened up ahead of them, the trail winding up into the pines and the snow and the clean, indifferent wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. Eva Mercer had run from a cage her whole life. For the first time, she felt like she might be running towards something instead. The trail up to Hawthorne Ridge took 2 hours on horseback, and it was 2 hours of pure, unrelenting mountain. The path climbed through stands of aspen, gone bare for winter, their white trunks catching the last of the afternoon gray. It curved around granite outcroppings, slick with new ice, dropped into a creek crossing that came up to the horses' knees, and then climbed again, steeper, until the pines closed overhead, and the wind dropped, and the world went very quiet. Eva rode in the middle of the group. Not because anyone told her to. It just worked out that way. Gideon out front reading the trail. Caleb to her left. Bo and Jude behind. Nobody talked much. The mountain demanded attention, and these were men who understood that. She used the silence to watch them. Gideon rode with the easy authority of someone who'd spent years in terrain far less forgiving than this. Former Army scout, he'd mentioned at the depot, briefly, the way men mention things they've put behind them. His back was straight but not rigid, his eyes always moving tree line, ridge, trail ahead, the habit of a man who'd learned the hard way that threats come from everywhere. Caleb was quieter than the others, which was saying something. He had a leather satchel slung across his saddle that clinked softly when his horse moved. Tincture bottles, she guessed. He caught her looking and gave her the same brief, calm nod he'd offered at the depot. No explanation, no sales pitch on himself. Jude rode behind her and said nothing at all, which she respected. His silence was different from Caleb's. Caleb's quiet was settled. Jude's had edges. Bo hummed occasionally under his breath half a bar of something. Then he'd stop, then start again. His horse was visibly fonder of him than horses generally are of people. The animal kept tilting its head back as if checking on him. Then the trail bent east. The pines parted, and Hawthorne Ridge opened up. Eva pulled her horse to a stop without meaning to. The house was enormous. 3 stories of hand-hewn log, the wood gone dark and silver with age, chinked tight against the mountain cold. A covered porch ran the full length of the front. 2 stone chimneys bookended the roof line, both of them putting out smoke that drifted west in the wind. Behind the main structure, she could make out a barn, a smithy, a low storage building, and the skeletal frame of something being built a 4th outbuilding. Maybe the raw timbers pale gold against the dark tree line. Beyond all of it, the Rockies. Layer after layer of them going blue and gray and white into the distance, so big they made the sky look small. "You built this?" she asked. "Our father started it." Gideon had come up beside her. "We finished it. Keep finishing it." She nodded slowly. There was something in that answer she understood. Some things don't have a finished. You just keep working them. They rode in, dismounted, and Bo took all 5 horses to the barn with the practiced efficiency of someone who would rather be there than anywhere else. The remaining 3 brothers walked Eva to the front door, and Gideon pushed it open and stood aside. She walked in. The entry opened into a great room that ran the full depth of the house. A stone fireplace took up most of the east wall, big enough to stand in, currently roaring. Long plank table in the center, 8 chairs around it. Bookshelves along the north wall, fuller than she expected. A staircase going up on the left, solid and wide, the banister worn smooth from years of hands. It smelled like pine smoke and coffee and leather, and something else underneath the particular smell of a house that's been lived in hard and maintained carefully, where things fixed when they break and nothing is wasted. Caleb moved past her without ceremony and put a kettle on the iron range. Jude hung his coat on a peg by the door, glanced at her once, and headed upstairs. Gideon stayed in the room, and there was something deliberate about it. "Come sit," he said. They sat at the table, Gideon across from her, Caleb to the side, and after a few minutes, Bo came in from the barn and took the last chair. Jude came back down with the unhurried step of a man who'd been moving things, making space. Caleb poured coffee, set a cup in front of her first. Gideon folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly, the same way he'd looked at Daltrey, except without the danger behind it, just clear and steady. "We should talk plainly about what this arrangement is," he said. "I'd appreciate that. You're here as a paid employee. Fair wages, the same we'd pay any hired hand. You manage the household as you see fit. We're not looking for someone to take orders from us on that front. You know what needs doing better than we do." He paused. "In exchange, we teach you what we know about surviving out here. Tracking, reading weather, what plants will kill you, and which ones heal. Whatever you want to learn." Eva looked at him, and in return, That's the return. Both sides get something worth having. She thought about that. It was more equitable than anything she'd been offered in Virginia. More equitable than most contracts she'd ever seen. "What are the house rules?" she asked. Gideon glanced at his brothers briefly, then back to her. "One rule that matters. You have absolute say over yourself, your space, your time, your person. Nobody here will touch you, crowd you, or pressure you. Not for any reason." He said it plainly, like he was stating geography. "If that ever changes, if any of us ever makes you feel otherwise, you come to me, or you come to whichever of us you trust, and it gets handled." The other three were quiet. Caleb had both hands around his coffee cup, looking at the table. Bo was watching Gideon. Jude was watching her, the way he seemed to watch everything alert. Measuring, but without hostility. "You'd make that promise for all four of you," Eva said. "We would," Caleb said. First time he'd spoken since the trail. His voice was lower than Gideon's, unhurried. "We're not men who make promises we don't intend to keep." She believed them. She wasn't sure why she believed them so quickly, but she did. Maybe it was because none of them had made a single unnecessary gesture since she'd met them. No showing off, no posturing, just four men saying what they meant. "All right," she said. "I can work with that." Gideon nodded once. "Caleb will show you your room." Caleb took her upstairs to the third floor. "The quietest story of the house," he explained, "furthest from the smithy noise and the barn." He opened the door on a room that was, by any frontier standard, exceptional wide pine floorboards, a real bed with a thick wool mattress, a writing table under the window with an oil lamp on it, a washstand with a clean basin, a cast iron wood stove in the corner, already lit, and a heavy interior bolt on the door. Solid iron, newly installed by the look of it. The wood around the bracket was still pale where it hadn't had time to darken. Eva stood in the room and ran her thumb over the bolt. Caleb was already turning to leave. He hadn't made anything of it, hadn't pointed to it with any ceremony, hadn't waited for her to notice and react. It was just there, the same as the lamp and the stove. Something practical, something that said your safety matters here without requiring her to feel grateful for it. "Thank you," she said. He paused in the doorway. "Supper's at 6. You don't have to cook it." "Jude's making stew." "A beet. He's better at it than he looks." She almost smiled. "I'll be down." He left, and his footsteps were quiet on the stairs. Eva set her carpet bag on the bed and looked around the room for a long moment. Outside the window, the mountains were going purple in the early dark, and the first real snow of the evening was starting to fall, thick and steady and silent. She'd been afraid for 3 weeks straight. Not obviously, she hadn't cried, hadn't frozen, hadn't let Daltrey or anyone else see anything they could use against her. But the fear had been there, a constant pressure behind the ribs. It loosened, not all the way, but some. She unlatched the window an inch, let cold air in, listened to the wind move through the pines. Then she unpacked her bag, hung her coat on the peg behind the door, and set her mother's law primer on the writing table next to the lamp. Below her, she heard the distant rhythm of an axe splitting wood. She went to the window. In the last gray light, she could make out Gideon in the yard, working through a cord of logs with efficient, unhurried strokes. Bo was stacking. Jude was hauling water from the well in 2 buckets at once, moving without complaint or comment, as though hauling water was just a thing people did because water needed hauling. None of them were waiting for her to come down and help. None of them had suggested she stood at the window. For another minute, the snow fell. The axe rang out in the quiet. Then she went downstairs to set the supper table, because she wanted to, and that the wanting to, the choosing to made all the difference. Jude's stew was, in fact, better than he looked. November settled in hard and stayed. By the end of the first week, Eva understood that Hawthorne Ridge operated on its own logic, separate from anything she'd known in Virginia, or read about frontier life in the newspapers that tended to make the West sound either romantic or lawless, and were generally wrong about both. The brothers rose before light. Not together, not by arrangement, they just did. each on his own internal schedule, drawn out of sleep by the particular instinct of men whose work started when the dark did. By the time Eva came downstairs each morning, the fire was already built up. The coffee was on, and at least one of them was out in the cold, doing something that needed doing. She adapted faster than she expected. Within 3 days, she knew where everything in the kitchen was kept, which floorboards creaked on the second-floor landing, and that the iron range had a hot spot on the left side that would burn biscuits if you weren't watching. Within a week, she'd reorganized the larder by season and shelf life, mended 2 of Beau's shirts, and figured out that the house ran better when supper was. Earlier on days when Gideon came back from the far tree line he rode out sometimes before dawn and came back after dark, quiet and wrung out from whatever calculation the mountain required of him. She started having his plate ready by 5 on those days, not because anyone asked, because she noticed. The brothers noticed that she noticed. None of them said anything about it. The learning went both ways, which was how Gideon had framed it, and he'd meant it. Caleb took her through his medicinal stores. The second morning, dried yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for fever, a tincture of valerian he kept in a blue bottle for pain that wouldn't quit. He explained each one without condescension, in the clear, methodical voice of someone who'd taught himself everything he knew and understood that knowledge was most useful when it moved to another person. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, lifting a bundle of dried echinacea to her nose. "Books, mostly. And an old Ute woman named Brightwater, who had more patience with me than I deserved." He was sorting through a tray of small cloth packets, organizing by what needed replenishing. "She taught me that most medicine isn't a secret. People keep it secret to keep power." She didn't believe in that. Eva looked at him. "Neither do I." He glanced up briefly. "I know." He handed her a slim, handwritten notebook, his own notes, she realized, pages dense with careful script. "You can read through that. Copy whatever you want." She held the notebook like it was something valuable, because it was. Not the kind of value you put in a safe, the kind you pass on. Jude was harder to read than his brothers, but the Ridge Perimeter Project gave her a way in. He was reinforcing the fence line on the north side of the property, replacing posts that had rotted over the summer, resetting wire that the elk had pushed through. Eva showed up one morning with a second pair of work gloves and a post hole digger and didn't ask permission. She just started on the section 20 yards down from where he was working. He watched her for about 30 seconds. Then he turned back to his own post and kept going. They worked in parallel silence for 2 hours. It wasn't uncomfortable. Jude was someone who communicated more through presence than words, and Eva had grown up in a house where words were often used to obscure rather than reveal, so the silence felt honest to her. Eventually, he said, without preamble, "You set posts before?" "My mother's fence line, every spring." He made a short sound that might have been approval. "Drive them deeper out here. Ground moves in the freeze." "How deep?" 3 feet minimum on the north side. Wind comes off that ridge. It'll push anything shallower right out. She adjusted her work accordingly. He watched to make sure she had it, then looked away. Later, when they were gathering the tools to head back, he spoke again without looking at her. "Those men who came after you at the depot. There'll be more." It wasn't a question. "Probably," she said. "Alcott, that's the name? Your ex-fiancé?" "Harrison Alcott. Philadelphia. Old money and the disposition to match." Jude picked up the post-hole digger and slung it over his shoulder. His jaw worked for a moment. "Men like that don't send one collector and give up." "No," she agreed. "They don't." He looked at her then, directly, which he didn't do often. His eyes were dark and serious, and something in them had been through fire and hadn't entirely come back out. "We've dealt with men like that before. Not from the East, but same principle. They believe what they own is what they deserve." He paused. "We don't agree with that principle." "Neither do I," she said again. He picked up his coat from the fence post and walked back toward the house. Eva walked beside him, and the snow started again, fine and dry, sifting through the bare aspens. It was the longest conversation she'd had with Jude. It felt like she'd earned it. Bo was different from all three of his brothers in ways that were obvious and ways that weren't. The obvious ways: he was the youngest, the least weathered, still carrying something open in his face that the others had either never had or had long since learned to protect. He laughed easier than they did. He talked to his horses in full sentences and didn't seem embarrassed about it. The less obvious ways took longer to surface. Eva found him one evening at the kitchen table with a primer open in front of him and a look on his face that was concentrated and frustrated in equal measure. He was 22, the same as her, and he could read but slowly, and certain letter combinations tripped him up in ways that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with how his eyes processed the page. She sat down across from him without making it a thing. "What are you reading?" He showed her the cover. "A History of the American West. Gideon got it for me. I've been on page 47 for a week. Can I?" She held out her hand. He passed it over. She looked at the page he was on, then back at him. "Read me the first line." He did, slowly, getting most of it right, stumbling on one word he couldn't get his eyes to separate out. "Your brain is reading the letters in a different order than they're printed," she said. "It's not a problem with your intelligence. It's a problem with the pattern. There are ways to work around it." She pushed the book back to him and turned it so they could both see the page. "We can practice." He looked at her. "You know how to teach reading? My mother was a school teacher. I grew up watching her work with students who learned differently." She picked up the nearest pencil and tapped it on the table. "It takes time, but it works." Bo was quiet for a moment. He had the same habit as Gideon of going still when something mattered. "Why would you do that?" "Because you want to read the book," she said simply, "and you should be able to." They sat there for an hour, working through page 47, at a pace that had nothing to do with speed and everything to do with getting it right. By the end, he'd read the whole page himself. Not perfectly, but solidly. He closed the book and sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath through his nose, the particular exhale of someone who's been carrying something heavy and just put it down. "Thank you," he said. "Same time tomorrow," she told him. He smiled. It was a good smile, unguarded, genuinely happy, the smile of a 22-year-old who just realized something important hadn't been taken from him after all. Gideon, she understood him, in pieces. He was out the most of any of them, riding the ridge and the territory beyond it, in a pattern she slowly recognized as patrol. He was checking things the trail into the valley, the passes north and south, the boundary of their land. Not paranoid. Systematic. The habits of a man who'd spent years, as a scout, reading landscape for intent. One afternoon in the third week, she was carrying water from the well when she came around the side of the barn and nearly walked into him. He caught the bucket she almost dropped. His hands closed around hers for a fraction of a second before he got a grip on the handle, and she felt the warmth of them through her work gloves. "I've got it," she said. "I know." He didn't take the bucket. He stepped back and waited. She carried it herself, and he walked beside her, not offering again, not making an issue of the fact that it was heavy, and she was managing it fine. "How's the reading going with Bo?" he asked. "Good. He's sharp. The pattern work is clicking for him." She adjusted her grip. "You knew he struggled with it, since he was small. We tried different things. Nothing quite worked. Did you take him to a teacher in town?" Gideon was quiet for a pace or two. "We tried." The schoolmaster told him he was slow. In front of the other children. Eva's jaw tightened. She kept walking. "That's not a teacher. That's someone with authority and no understanding of what to do with it." "We didn't go back." "Good." She set the bucket down by the porch step. "Your mother, did she teach any of you?" "She taught us all to read before she died." Bo was 4. Didn't get as far. Something moved briefly across his face and was gone. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply and didn't elaborate, and somehow the lack of elaboration made it mean more. The first real cold came that night. Not the polite cold of early November, But the serious kind, the kind that got into the wall joints and made the house creak and dropped the temperature in the barn, enough that Bo was out before dawn, wrapping the horses in extra blankets. Eva woke to it and lay in her bed for a moment, listening to the house. She could hear the stoves working. She could hear faintly someone downstairs. The particular rhythm of Caleb's movements measured, unhurried. She pulled on her wool dress and her heaviest socks and went down. Caleb was at the range, making a poultice of some kind, his work spread across the table in organized rows. He looked up when she appeared. One of the barn cats got into a fight. Wounds infected. Can I help? He looked at the spread of materials, then at her. You can hold her still while I clean it. She bites, I'll manage. They worked side by side at the table, Caleb cleaning the wound with a solution that smelled of yarrow and clean water, Eva keeping firm, gentle hold of the cat, who was absolutely opposed to the whole procedure. Their arms crossed occasionally. He'd reach for something, and she'd already have it in her other hand. And after the third or fourth time that happened, they developed a wordless efficiency, moving around each other without colliding. The cat settled eventually. Caleb bound the wound with clean linen and set her in a basket near the range. She'll be fine, he said. Good. Eva washed her hands in the basin. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window, the snow was falling again, steady and thick, blurring the tree line to gray. Caleb made 2 cups of coffee, without asking if she wanted one. He handed her the cup and they stood at the window, not talking, watching the snow come down. She was aware of him standing there, aware of the warmth coming off him, the steadiness of his breathing, the way his hands wrapped the tin cup with that same unhurried care he applied to everything. She was aware that she wasn't uncomfortable with his closeness, which was new. She'd spent years learning to be guarded around men, because guarded was the only safe setting. This was different. Caleb, why did you all give up on town life? Or was it never, were you always up here? He looked at the snow. We had property in the valley before the ridge, smaller. 3 years ago, there was a syndicate moving through the territory, buying out land claims by force. If a family didn't sell, they had accidents. Fires, mostly. His voice stayed level, but his hands got tighter on the cup. There was a Ute settlement at the base of the pass. The syndicate wanted that land for a railroad access route. They started moving on it. And you intervened. We intervened. A pause. It cost us the valley, property, and any goodwill we had in 2 of the 3 local towns. There are people who don't forgive you for making them look cowardly. By comparison. He looked at her. But the settlement is still there. Eva held that for a moment. It explained the isolation, the self-sufficiency, the way all 4 of them seemed entirely unconcerned with what the wider world thought of them. They hadn't retreated from life. They'd chosen a different one on their own terms after the wider world had shown them exactly what it valued. She thought about her mother, who'd taught school in Virginia for 15 years and been asked to leave, when she started teaching the black children in their county. After the war, who'd lost the job and kept teaching anyway, in the kitchen, in the evenings, to whoever showed up. Some things you do because they're right, her mother used to say, even when right is expensive. My mother would have liked all 4 of you, she said. Caleb almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved. She sounds like someone worth knowing. She was. The snow came down. The fire worked in the stove. Outside, the Rockies were invisible in the white, somewhere behind the dark and the cold. Eva drank her coffee and stood in the warm kitchen and felt for the second time since arriving at Hawthorne Ridge that loosening behind her ribs. It went a little further this time. The blizzard came without much warning. There had been signs, if you knew how to read them. The barometric pressure had been dropping since noon. Gideon had noticed it, remarked on it at supper without alarm, the way he remarked on most things. The horses had been restless in the barn all afternoon, circling their stalls. By 7 o'clock, the wind had picked up enough to make the shutters work, and by 8, the snow was coming sideways, off the north ridge, in sheets that turned the yard into a white wall. Eva was in the kitchen, with Caleb going over his herb inventory, when Gideon came in from outside, with snow plastered to his oilskin, and his jaw set in a way she'd learned to read as controlled urgency. "There's a family down at the valley base," he said. "Homesteaders. New claim, probably dug in for winter. Their shelter won't hold this." Caleb was already pushing back from the table. "How long ago did you see them?" 2 days. Past their camp on the South Trail. They had a canvas structure over a partial timber frame. Nothing close to finished. Children? At least one. Young. Eva stood up. "I'm coming." Gideon looked at her, not with doubt, but with the frank assessment of a man calculating what the mountain required. "It'll be bad going, I know." She was already moving toward the coat pegs. Caleb's medical kit. Extra blankets. "Rope!" "What else?" A beat of silence. Then Gideon said, "Ropes in the barn. Blankets in the cedar chest on the second landing." He turned without further argument. "Jude, Bo, ride out." They went into the storm 5 strong. The ride down the South Trail was the hardest 40 minutes Eva had spent since leaving Virginia, and Virginia hadn't tried to freeze her to death. The wind came in gusts that hit like a wall, and the trail was already drifting over, the horses planting their feet with deliberate care in snow that came up past their fetlocks. Gideon led, breaking trail. Eva stayed close to Caleb, who rode steady and unhurried beside her, his satchel strapped double across his chest. Bo was talking to his horse the whole way down. Low, continuous, calm. The horse trusted him completely and moved accordingly, and Eva watched that and thought there was a lesson in it about what trust actually produces. They heard the family before they saw them, a child crying, thin and high against the wind. Then a lantern came into view, swinging wildly, held by a man in a coat that was nowhere near enough for this weather. The shelter had half collapsed. One side of the canvas had blown loose and was snapping in the gale, and underneath it a woman was crouched over 2 children, her body between them and the wind, her face white with cold and fear. "Can you walk?" Gideon asked the man. "Yes," his teeth were chattering. "My wife, the little one, she's been feverish since this morning. We're going to get you up to the house." Gideon's voice cut through the wind without effort, not loud, just clear. The voice of someone who'd commanded men in conditions far worse. "Can your wife ride?" "She can." "Then let's move." Now, the man's name was Thomas Aldred. His wife was Margaret, barely 20 years old, holding a girl of 3 named Clara against her chest, and another child, a boy of 6, by the hand. Clara was burning up. Even in the cold, Eva could feel the heat radiating off her when she helped lift the girl onto Caleb's horse, where he held her in front of him for the ride up. They made the ridge in an hour. It felt longer. Inside, the house became a different kind of controlled chaos, the good kind, purposeful and competent. Bo took the horses. Jude built the fire in the main room up high and fast. Thomas Aldred tried to help and was gently but firmly redirected to the hearth to warm up, because a man with shaking hands and poor circulation isn't useful. And Gideon understood that without making Thomas feel useless about it. Eva took Margaret and the children upstairs to the room next to her own. "She needs dry clothes first," Caleb said, appearing in the doorway with his satchel open and a thermometer in his hand. He spoke to Margaret directly, not through Eva, not through Thomas. "What's been the fever like? Consistent or up and down?" "Up and down." Margaret's voice was steadier than her hands. She was a tough woman. Eva could see it. The particular toughness of someone who's been tested repeatedly and has learned to save her fear for after the crisis. Higher in the evenings. She won't eat. That's typical for this kind of fever. Caleb was already kneeling by the bed where Clara lay, his movements unhurried and exact. It's not good, but it's not the worst sign either. He looked up at Margaret. "I'm going to make a poultice for her chest and a willow bark tea for the fever. She'll fight the tea, it's bitter. Can you get her to take it if it's sweetened with honey? I can try. That's all I need." Eva spent the next 2 hours working alongside Caleb in a rhythm they'd developed from the barn cat incident, multiplied by 10. She held Clara while he administered the poultice, a warm compress of mustard and comfrey that went on the child's chest and smelled medicinal and sharp. She measured the willow bark tea into small doses, spoonfuls instead of cups, and carried them to Caleb on a schedule he set by checking his pocket watch. The little girl fought it, just as Margaret had predicted. She turned her head, pushed at their hands, made the miserable sounds of a very sick, very small person who has no interest in medicine. Eva held her firmly but gently, the same grip she'd used on the cat, and talked to her in a low, steady voice about nothing in particular, the horses in the barn, what the snow looked like from the window, the fact that Beau had a horse who particularly liked carrots. Clara didn't understand most of it, but she calmed. Caleb watched Eva over the child's head and said nothing, but he filed it away. The fever broke at 2 in the morning, not all at once. It didn't work that way. The child's temperature came down in slow degrees over the course of the night, until somewhere around 2 o'clock, Clara's skin finally lost its scorching heat, and she broke into a light sweat, and her breathing evened out. Caleb checked her temperature again, checked it a third time, and then sat back on his heels and let out a quiet breath. "She'll sleep now," he said. Real sleep. Margaret had been awake the entire time, sitting against the wall beside the bed, watching everything with the focused attention of a mother, cataloging everything done to her child, and why. When Caleb said those words, her head dropped forward, and she pressed her fist against her mouth for a moment. Eva put a hand on her shoulder. No words, just presence. Thomas was downstairs. He'd stayed out of the room. The room was too small, and he'd understood that. But when Eva came down at 2:30 to make tea, he was sitting at the kitchen table, awake, turning his hat in his hands with the mechanical repetition of a man who has nothing useful to do and cannot make him stop trying. He stood up when she came in, started to speak. Then, almost before she could register what he was doing, he went to his knees. "I can't." His voice broke. "I don't know how to thank if you hadn't come out in that storm." She would have. Gideon came in from the main room. He saw what was happening and crossed the kitchen in 4 strides. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just put his hand under Thomas Aldred's arm, firmly, and lifted him back to his feet. "Don't you ever kneel to another man," he said. It was quiet and absolute. "Human dignity and life are equal under God. We helped you out of basic human decency, not to play master." Thomas stared at him. Gideon let him look away until he saw Thomas understand it, not just hear it, but absorb it. The distinction mattered. This wasn't false modesty, the frontier custom of deflecting gratitude. Gideon meant it literally. Nobody in this house was above another man. Nobody in this house wanted someone kneeling at their feet. Thomas Aldred nodded slowly, something shifting in his face. He sat back in the chair like a man who'd just been told something he'd needed to hear for a long time. Eva put the kettle on. Jude appeared in the doorway, looked at the scene, and went to the range to cut bread without being asked. Beau came in from checking the horses, stamped snow off his boots, and sat down at the table across from Thomas, with the easy naturalness of someone who understood that what the man needed right now was ordinary human company. They sat around the table and drank tea and ate bread, and nobody made Thomas feel like a burden or a charity case or a man who owed a debt. He was just a neighbor who'd needed help and gotten it, the same as any of them would have needed and gotten. That was the whole of it. The Aldreds stayed 3 days while the blizzard ran itself out. By the 3rd morning, Clara was sitting up in bed, eating soft biscuits and demanding, in the imperious way of recovered 3-year-olds everywhere, that someone tell her another story about the carrot horse. Beau obliged. He sat on the edge of the bed and told her about Copper, his best quarter horse, with the same earnest seriousness he applied to everything, and Clara listened with enormous eyes and occasionally corrected details she couldn't possibly have known, and he agreed to all her corrections without argument. Eva watched from the doorway and felt something warm move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a word for. When the Aldrids left on the fourth morning, the sky had gone clear and hard and brilliantly blue, and the snow lay deep and unbroken over everything. Thomas shook hands with each brother, and when he got to Gideon, he held on for an extra moment. "I'll remember what you said," he told him. Gideon nodded. "See that you do." Margaret hugged Eva briefly, fiercely. Clara, riding in front of her father on his horse, waved until they went around the first bend and disappeared into the white pines. The five of them stood in the yard and watched them go. Then Jude said, "That child talks a lot for three." "She was sick," Bo said reasonably. "She had energy to make up." They went back inside, and the house felt the same as it always had. And Eva thought that was perhaps the best thing about these four men. They did good things, and then they simply went on. No monument, no account kept. Just went on. The document arrived on a Tuesday in a leather courier pouch, delivered by a rider who didn't give his name. Jude took it at the door. He brought it to Gideon, who read it once, set it flat on the table, and called for Eva. She read it, standing up. It was formatted as an arrest warrant and asset seizure notice issued under the seal of Larimer County, Colorado, charging one Evangeline Ann Mercer with grand theft, specifically the alleged theft of a diamond brooch and $1,100 in cash from the personal property of one Harrison Alcott of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was, in every aesthetic sense, a convincing document. Heavy paper, clean type, official language arranged in the proper sequence. A lesser reader might have been frightened into compliance immediately. Eva read it a second time. Then she set it down and looked at the seal. She picked it up again and brought it to the window where the light was better. The seal, embossed into the lower left corner, bore the inscription of Larimer County. The warrant, however, had been issued by a justice of the peace, whose listed address placed him in Douglas County, 60 miles south. "This seal is wrong," she said. Gideon came to look over her shoulder. Caleb crossed to her other side. Jude stayed at the table, arms folded, watching her work. "The warrant claims Larimer County jurisdiction," she said, keeping her voice even. "But the issuing justice is in Douglas County. They're separate jurisdictions entirely. A Douglas County justice of the peace has no authority to issue an arrest warrant carrying Larimer County's seal." She set the paper down. Harrison moved fast. Too fast. He didn't get the seals right. Caleb picked up the document and examined the seal himself. "So it's invalid. Completely. If this were brought before an actual judge, it would be thrown out before anyone read past the first paragraph." She thought about her mother's law primer on the writing table. Upstairs, her mother, who'd believed that legal literacy was a form of self-defense, who'd spent hours teaching Eva to read documents, contracts, and warrants with the same critical eye she'd apply to any text that claimed authority. Her mother had been right. She almost always was. "He's trying to force you out of the county," Gideon said. "It wasn't a question. He's trying to put me in a position where I come out to deal with it, or I look guilty by not appearing." Eva folded the document along its original creases. "If I respond, I'm giving him a location. If I don't, he files a second, proper warrant and uses the non-response as evidence." "So what do you do?" Bo asked from the doorway. "I go address it in person at the county seat, with the flaw identified and documented." She kept her voice steady. "I can contest this before it becomes anything real. A judge who knows his own jurisdiction won't uphold a warrant with this error." The room was quiet for a moment. "We'll ride with you," Jude said. "No." She said it simply, without apology. "If the four of you ride into the county seat with me, it looks like I need an armed escort. That's not the impression I want to make before a judge." She looked at Gideon. "And if Harrison has more men in the territory, I don't want them knowing which direction to come from." Gideon studied her for a long moment. She could see the calculation behind his eyes, not doubt in her. She understood that, but the particular tension of a man who sees a risk and must decide whether it's his to take on or someone else's to carry. "You know what you're doing," he said finally. "I do. You ride at dawn, you stay on the main trail. Nothing south of the creek crossing." Agreed. That settled it. There was no negotiation, no lecture on the dangers, no attempt to override her decision. Gideon disagreed with the plan in the way a person disagrees with necessary things they can't improve on, and he let her have it. Caleb gave her a leather document case for the warrant and a smaller sealed envelope in which he'd written, in his precise hand, a legal summary of the jurisdictional flaw. He'd studied enough law to know how to structure it. "Give that to the judge before you speak," he said. "Judges like to read first." Bo saddled her horse before she came down in the morning, packed the saddlebag with 2 days' food and a spare blanket, and said nothing except, "She's ready." Jude was the last to see her off. He handed her a small caliber pistol, cleaned and loaded, which she tucked into her coat. He looked at her for a moment. "Straight there," he said. "Don't stop for anyone, I know." He stepped back. She rode out. The morning was clear and brutally cold, the sky a deep, cloudless blue that in Virginia would have meant a warm day, and in Colorado meant the opposite. Her horse's breath came in long plumes. The trail was compacted ice under a shallow layer of new snow that gave her good footing if she kept to the center. She made good time down the south trail, through the creek crossing, onto the wider road that ran toward the valley floor, and eventually to the county seat at Red Ridge Township. She was 2 miles below the creek, moving through a narrow cut in the rock that the locals called Blood Pass when they came out of the trees. 4 men, positioned on both sides of the trail, which meant they'd been waiting, which meant they'd known her route, which meant the courier who'd brought the warrant had reported back. She pulled her horse to a stop and kept her hands visible, and thought very fast. The man in front was big, riding a gray, wearing the blank professional expression of someone who does this work for money and has made his peace with it. Not Daltrey, someone worse than Daltrey. Someone who didn't look like he cared whether she came back east on her own feet or otherwise. "Miss Mercer." He said it without particular inflection. "Mr. Alcott requests your return." "Mr. Alcott can make requests to a judge," she said. "He doesn't have legal authority over my person or my movements. The warrant he filed is fraudulent, mismatched jurisdictional seals, easily proven. If he persists, he'll be the one facing charges." The man on the gray smiled without any warmth. "We're not here about the warrant." She reached for the pistol in her coat. She was fast. She'd practiced, but there were 4 of them, and they'd anticipated exactly this. And before she cleared the coat, she felt the rope drop over her shoulders. They were efficient about it. She had to give them that. Within 2 minutes, her hands were bound in front of her, her horse's reins taken, her weapons removed. They didn't hit her. Nobody put a hand on her roughly. It was a professional operation, which somehow made it worse, more premeditated, more certain. They made camp in a shallow draw off the main trail, sheltered from the wind by a rock overhang, far enough off the road that passing riders wouldn't see the horses. They sat her against a pine and tied a secondary line to an exposed root and left her enough room to be upright, but not enough to do anything about it. The man on the gray didn't explain himself further. He ate cold food and checked his rifle, and didn't look at her, the professional indifference of someone who'd decided she was cargo. Eva looked at her bound hands. Then she looked at the camp. Then she looked at the tree line. She started thinking. Caleb had taught her about flint, hard, sharp-edged, found in creek beds and exposed rock faces. He'd mentioned it once while they were reinforcing the fence line, talking about primitive tools, what you could do with a good edge if you had to. He hadn't meant it as survival instruction. He'd just been talking, the way Caleb talked. Passing knowledge along the way, you hand someone a tool they might need someday. She'd listened. She always listened. The ground around the pine was a mix of compacted soil and loose stone. She worked her boot heel carefully across the surface, slow, without drawing attention. The men had stopped watching her with any particular vigilance. She was tied and disarmed, and they'd made their calculation. Her heel found something. Small, irregular edge. She shifted her weight gradually and worked it to the surface. Flint, roughly triangular. Not large, but the edge was good. She picked it up with her bound hands and held it still and waited. While she waited, she looked west. She could still see the mountain above the tree line from here, Hawthorne Ridge, the high point of the property, dark against the early afternoon sky. And then she saw it, a column of black smoke rising from the direction of the ridge, too thick and too fast for a chimney, climbing straight up into the cold air before the wind took it east. Not a fire in the fireplace, not burning brush. The smoke was coming from the house. Her stomach dropped through the ground. She sat absolutely still and watched the smoke climb and thought about the four men up there and forced her breathing to stay. Even. She forced it because panicking would kill her. Because whatever was happening on the ridge, she could not help anyone from the end of a rope. She worked the flint against her bindings with focused, controlled movements. The mercenary on the gray was eating. The other three were talking. The fire they'd built crackled between them, pulling their attention inward. She sawed. The rope was good quality, thick, tightly woven. It didn't give easily. But Flint is patient, and so was she, and her mother had taught her that patience applied consistently was a form of power that didn't make noise. The first strand parted. The smoke from the ridge was still rising. Darker now, which could mean the structure was going, or it could mean they'd gotten it under control and were burning the worst of it out. She didn't know. She couldn't know. She kept sawing. The second strand went. The third took longest. The rope was doubled at this point, the innermost core, and she had to adjust the angle of the flint twice to get purchase. Her wrists ached. She didn't stop. When the last strand parted, she held the rope together with her fingers and breathed. The guard closest to her was looking at the fire. She waited until he turned his head to say something to the man beside him. Then she moved. She moved the moment his head turned. Not fast. Fast would have made noise. She rose in one slow, controlled push, keeping the rope gathered in her fingers so it didn't drag across the pine bark, and stepped left into the shadow of the boulder behind the tree. 3 seconds. Nobody shouted. The fire crackled. One of the men laughed at something. She breathed. The tree line was 15 feet to her right. The horse were picketed 20 feet past that, 6 of them, tied to a rope, strung between 2 aspens. The gray, the lead man's horse, was on the near end. She didn't want the gray. She wanted the bay at the far end, a compact, wide-chested animal that had been standing quiet all afternoon while the others shifted. Quiet horses don't spook. She needed a horse that wouldn't spook. She made the tree line in 8 careful steps, placing each foot before she put weight on it, the way Jude had shown her when they were tracking elk last month on the north perimeter. He hadn't been teaching her to escape a mercenary camp. He'd been teaching her to see, to move like part of the landscape instead of against it. She used it anyway. The horses felt her before they saw her. She clicked her tongue once, low, and held out her hand. The bay turned its head and took 1 step toward her and didn't make a sound. She untied the lead line with numb fingers, got the rope over its neck, and led it away from the others through the trees at a walk. 30 yards. 40. She kept walking. When she was far enough that the firelight was just a dull orange flicker through the pines, she put her foot in the stirrup and got up. She didn't go south. South was the road, the obvious path, and obvious was what they'd expect. She pointed the bay northeast and let it pick its way through the timber at a cautious trot, following a downslope that she recognized from the general shape of the terrain. If she was right about where Blood Pass sat relative to the ridge, northeast would bring her to the creek. Crossing inside an hour, she looked at the sky. The smoke was still there. Less of it now. The thick black column had thinned to a gray smudge against the dark blue of early evening, which could mean the fire had run out of fuel, or it could mean the house was gone and there was nothing left to burn. She drove that thought out and kept riding. The creek crossing was where she expected it. She went through fast, the bay lunging at the far bank, ice-cold water soaking her to the knee. She didn't stop. She pressed up the south trail at a canter, the horse breathing hard in the cold, the mountain rising dark and enormous ahead of her. She smelled the smoke before she saw the damage. It wasn't the house. That was the first thing she confirmed when she broke through the last tree line and pulled the bay to a stop in the yard. The main structure was standing. All 3 stories, both stone chimneys, the covered porch, all of it intact, silhouetted against the darkening sky. The smithy was gone. What remained of it was a low black shape. Still smoking at the edges, the timber frame collapsed inward. The stone foundation was intact. Everything on top of it was ash. Bo's horse copper was in the yard, fully saddled, stamping at the ground. 2 other horses were tied at the porch rail. Saddled, packed, she swung down and went up the steps. The front door opened before she reached it. Gideon came through first, and for one fractional second, when he saw her, his face did something she'd never seen it do before. Something unlocked, briefly, behind his eyes. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was the sharp, controlled attention of a man taking inventory. "You're on horseback," he said. "Their horse. I got loose." She came inside and he closed the door. The great room was lit by 2 oil lamps and the fireplace, which was burning high. Jude was at the table with a rifle across his knees, cleaning it with quick, precise movements. Caleb was at the sideboard with his satchel open and a burn on his left forearm that had been wrapped in linen. "Are you all right?" "Fine." Caleb didn't look up. Incendiary came through the smithy window. "I was in the yard. Structure went fast. We got the animals out," Bo said from the stairs. He was sitting on the 3rd step with his elbow on his knees and a cut above his eyebrow that someone had already cleaned. Copper kicked through his stall board, but he's fine. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at all 4 of them. All 4 present. All 4 upright and breathing. The tightness in her chest released with such force that she had to press her lips together and breathe through her nose for a moment. Gideon was watching her. She met his eyes, and he gave her one short nod that said he understood exactly what that look cost her to contain. "They'll come back," Jude said, not looking up from the rifle. "Tonight. They hit the smithy first to draw us out, take stock of the numbers. Now they know we're not running." He ran the cleaning patch along the barrel. "They come back for the rest." "How many?" Eva asked. "We tracked 6 sets of prints in the snow around the property. They came in from the North Ridge, which means they know the trail system." Gideon moved to the table and spread a hand-drawn map on the surface, the same one he used for his ridge patrols. 2 stayed on the ridge. 2 came down to the smithy. 2 were positioned at the tree line. They're probably to cut off anyone trying to reach the barn. Eva came to the table. She looked at the map. She looked at the terrain she'd just ridden through and cross-referenced it in her head with what Gideon was saying. "There are 4 more at Blood Pass," she said, "plus the man leading them. Gray Horse. He's not a local hire, he's professional. He worked in teams, and he positioned everyone before I ever came down the trail this morning, which means they had at least 1 man watching the house yesterday." Jude looked up. "The courier?" "Yes, she'd worked that out on the ride up. The man who delivered the warrant, he reported back." Caleb tied off the linen on his arm and pulled his sleeve down. "So there are at least 9 of them, total, at least. And they're armed." "Yes, but they're not a coordinated military unit. They're working for money, which means they have a ceiling." She looked at Gideon. "Push them hard enough and the calculation changes." Gideon studied the map. He had the stillness of someone thinking at full capacity while appearing to do very little. Then he said, "Jude, take the north approach. High ridge, above the old elk trail. If they come down from there, I want to know before they clear the tree line." Jude stood, slung the rifle, and was out the back door in 30 seconds. "Bo." Gideon didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Horses, keep them out of the barn and in the shelter of the south tree line. If it goes badly here, you get Eva out. That's your priority." "No," Eva said. Gideon looked at her. "I'm not a priority to be extracted. I'm a person who can shoot." She kept her voice even. "I know the camp layout. I know where they've positioned their gear, and I know who's in command and where he sits. That information has value. Use it. The room was quiet. Caleb, in that particular way he had of making a decision visible without any performance, closed his satchel and set it on the shelf by the door. She's right, he said. We're more effective with her than without. Bo said nothing, but he nodded once, the smallest motion, the kind that meant he'd been thinking the same thing. Gideon looked at her for another moment. There was no argument in his face. There was something else, recognition, maybe, the look of a man seeing a person clearly and adjusting to what he sees. All right, he said, tell me the camp. She told him everything, the layout of the fire, the position of the picketed horses, the rock overhang, the distances between men, where the ammunition would be stored, where the lead man slept away from the others, slightly elevated, which was a command habit. Gideon listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he looked at the map and traced a line with his finger. Caleb comes in from the west, cuts the horses free. Spooked horses in a camp at night cause chaos, and they cause it fast. He moved his finger. I take the north side above the fire. Draw their attention up the ridge. He looked at Eva. You come in from the east, you know the terrain from the inside out, you hit the lead man. I can do that, I know. He picked up his rifle. Bo, you're with Eva, not to protect her, to cover her left flank. Bo picked up his coat without a word and handed Eva hers from the peg by the door. They went out into the dark. The night was hard and clear. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees since sundown, the snow underfoot, packed and silent, no wind. The mountain had gone absolutely still in the way it sometimes did in deep cold, all its ambient noise compressed under the weight of the freeze. They separated without ceremony at the edge of the yard. Caleb went west. Gideon went north. Eva and Bo angled east along the lower slope, staying below the ridgeline, using the same boulder line she'd used earlier to stay out of sight. Bo moved better in the dark than she'd expected. He was light on his feet for his size, and he followed her line exactly one step behind, and to her left, his presence steady and undemanding. He didn't try to go in front. He didn't second-guess her direction. He just came. She found the rock overhang by the smell of the fire before she saw the light of it. She gestured and Bo stopped. She went to her knee and looked. 5 men still in camp. The lead man was where she'd calculated against the South Rock face, elevated, separate from the others, his gray horse picketed closest to him. He had a rifle across his lap and his eyes on the ridge, watching for something to come down from above. That was the tell. All 5 of them were watching the high ground. Nobody was watching the east. She waited, counting her breath. Bo crouched beside her without a sound. Then the horses screamed. All at once, from the west side of the camp, the picketed animals erupted, pulling lines, spinning, colliding with each other in the panic that only spooked horses produce. That particular combination of 600-pound bodies and pure animal terror that turns a contained space into absolute chaos. 2 men jumped up shouting. A third went for the horses on instinct, which took him away from his rifle. The lead man on the gray scrambled to his feet and turned toward the noise. Eva was already moving. She came out of the dark at a run, low and fast, and had the rifle barrel at the lead man's spine before he heard her. She felt the moment he registered what was happening, the freeze that goes through a professional when someone gets inside their perimeter without their knowledge. It's different from fear. It's a specific kind of recognition. Don't, she said. He didn't. Hands out. He put them out. Gideon came in from the north over the next 40 seconds, and Jude came down off the ridge, where he'd gotten above 2 men she hadn't known about, who'd been watching the ridgeline from the high side. By the time the chaos in the horse line had resolved itself, and the remaining men understood what had happened to their camp, they were looking at 4 very large, very calm mountain men, and a woman with a rifle trained on their commander, and not one of those faces communicated anything except absolute certainty about what happened next if the mercenaries made the wrong choice. They made the right choice. The lead man gave his name as Garrett. He confirmed what Eva had suspected. He worked for a private contracting firm out of Denver that took assignments from wealthy clients without asking too many questions about the legality of the work. Harrison Alcott had hired the firm through an intermediary to retrieve Eva and neutralize any resistance. The fire at the smithy had been a warning shot. The main assault had been planned for midnight. Gideon listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, Alcott's name, his intermediary's name, the name of the firm. Garrett hesitated. Gideon waited. He was good at waiting. Garrett gave him the names. Caleb wrote them down in his notebook with his left hand, his burned arm held careful at his side. They sent the men south on foot horses, released, weapons held, enough food to make the valley in a day's walk. Not because they were inclined toward mercy as an abstraction, but because Gideon understood that federal marshals needed witnesses more than they needed bodies, and men walking south in the cold toward town with a story to tell were more useful to justice than men who weren't walking anywhere. That was the calculation. Eva understood it. She agreed with it. On the walk back up the South Trail, Bo came up beside her and matched her pace. You didn't hesitate, he said. In the camp, hesitation is a choice, she said. So is moving. He thought about that. Caleb teach you that? My mother taught me that. She looked up at the stars, dense and close and brilliant over the ridge. She said, fear is information. You use it. You don't let it use you. Bo was quiet for a step or two. She sounds like someone I would have liked. She would have liked you too, Eva said. She had a particular fondness for people who talked to horses. Bo laughed. It was genuine and unguarded, and it went up into the cold air and dissolved into the dark. Ahead of them, Gideon's outline moved steady against the snow, and Caleb was just to his left, and Jude had already ranged ahead the way he always did, reading the trail. She walked up the mountain toward the lights of the house, and she thought about the word home and what it was made of, and decided it was made of exactly this. The bathhouse was the oldest structure on the property. Eva hadn't seen the inside of it yet. It sat at the back edge of the cleared yard, tucked into the slope behind the main house, built from stone, quarried out of the same ridge the house sat on. The walls were 18 inches thick. The roof was sod-over timber, heavy and low. It had outlasted everything else the Hawthorne family had built on this land, including 2 barns and a smokehouse, and the particular endurance of the place had less to do with construction than with the fact that stone absorbs warmth differently than wood. It holds it longer, gives it back slowly. Bo had the fire going inside before the rest of them cleared the tree line. Eva walked in first and stopped. The room was square, low-ceilinged, lit by an iron brazier in the corner, and 2 oil lanterns hung from the ceiling beams. The heating stones were already hot, a row of them along the south wall, radiating dry warmth that hit her like a physical thing after the long, cold hours outside. A wooden tub big enough for a man of Gideon's size sat in the center. On a shelf beside the door were clean linen cloths, a bar of lye soap, a basin, and a clay jug of water someone had set to warming on the stone ledge. The room smelled like clean wood and minerals and heat. She stood in the warmth for a moment and just breathed. The brothers came in behind her, Gideon first, then Jude, then Caleb, Bo already there. They took up the 4 corners of the room, the way they always occupied space together, without crowding, each one in his particular orbit. Gideon set his rifle against the wall. Jude hung his coat on the wooden peg. Caleb moved directly to the shelf, already thinking about wound care, his professional instinct overriding everything else. Eva crossed to the shelf and took the clean linen and the basin of warm water before he could. Sit, she said. Caleb looked at her. Your arm, she said, and Bo, that cut above your eye. Both of you sit down. Caleb sat. That was how she knew how much his arm actually hurt. Caleb never sat when he could stand. He settled on the wooden bench along the east wall and unwound the linen she'd watched him wrap 3 hours ago. Efficient and self-contained even then. The burn was worse than he'd shown. It ran from his wrist to mid-forearm, not deep but broad, the kind of burn that comes from proximity to a flash fire, where the heat gets into the top layer of skin all at once. He'd cleaned it himself, which was why it was clean, and wrapped it without complaint, which was characteristic. Eva wrung the linen cloth in warm water and began cleaning it again. More carefully this time. You should have said it was this bad, she told him. We had other priorities. Your arm is a priority. She kept her hand steady. How does it feel now? Manageable. She looked at him. He met her eyes calmly, the way he met everything, but there was something in the line around his jaw that was slightly tighter than usual. Meaning painful, she said. Meaning manageable, he said again without apology. She didn't argue. She just worked. She knew where Caleb kept the burn salve she'd helped him make it 3 weeks ago. Calendula in rendered fat, slow-cooked, over low heat for half a day. She got it from the shelf and applied it with the flat of her fingers, spreading it in smooth, careful strokes. He didn't flinch. His breathing stayed even. But at some point, his free hand settled on the bench beside him with slightly more deliberate stillness than usual. And she understood he was managing himself. And she respected it. When she tied off the clean linen over the salve, he looked down at the work and then up at her. Thank you, he said. Same as you did for Clara, she said simply. And that was the whole of it. Beau submitted to the eyebrow cut with considerably less composure than Caleb had managed. Not from pain, but from the particular discomfort of someone who disliked being fussed over on principle. He kept tilting his head to look at what she was doing, which required her to tilt it back. Stop moving. I just want to see. There's nothing to see. It's a cut. Hold still. Gideon, from across the room, where he'd been standing with his coat off and his forearms braced on the wooden shelf, made a short sound that might have been amusement. Jude, who was sitting on the floor against the far wall with his knees up and his head back against the stone, did not react at all, but the line of his mouth softened by a degree. Beau held still. Eva closed the cut with 2 strips of clean linen pressed in a cross and told him to leave it alone. And he said he would, and she gave it a 40% chance that he would. She rose and turned. The 4 of them were in the same room, and the room was warm, and they were all in one piece. And for a moment she just stood there looking at them, Gideon, with his silver-templed dark hair, and the weariness around his eyes that he never mentioned, Caleb holding his bandaged arm, careful, and still thinking through something, Jude with his eyes closed against the stone wall, and his hard face gone quiet in the heat. Beau sitting on the bench, looking young and alive, and grateful to be both. She'd known them for 1 month. 1 month of mornings and snowfall and fence posts and herb bundles and borrowed books and honest conversation. And a bolt on her door that nobody had ever required her to use. 1 month of being seen not as a problem to be solved or a thing to be claimed, but as a person who had her own mind and her own sense of what she wanted. She did know what she wanted. She'd known it for 2 weeks and kept the knowledge at arm's length because there was too much else happening, and she'd thought correctly that now was not the time. Now, the fire was out. The men were gone. The mountain was quiet. Now was the time. She pulled the tie from her hair and let it fall. She looked at Gideon first. He was already looking at her. He'd been looking at her since she walked in. He was still, the way he went still, when something mattered not frozen, just gathered. His pale eyes were darker in the lamplight. Eva? He said. His voice was the same as always, low and certain and without performance. I know what I'm doing, she said. I know what I want, and I'm asking. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with the same plain truthfulness he brought to everything, You're sure? I have been for 2 weeks, she said. He crossed the room to her, and it was 4 steps slow, giving her every inch of space to change her mind, and she didn't. I want you so bad, the Virgin whispered. The 4 mountain men's fingers left her skin burning. Not all at once, not in a rush. In the way that men who have spent their lives understanding patience understand it, that the slow things are the ones that last. Gideon's hands came up first, one on either side of her face, and he tilted her face toward him, and she saw in his expression something she'd never seen in anyone's face before. Not possession, not triumph. Reverence, maybe the look of someone handling something they consider worth taking care of. He kissed her. It was warm and certain and unhurried, and she felt it in her spine. Caleb came up behind her, and his presence was different from Gideon's, quieter, more deliberate. The warmth of him coming first, before his hands settled on her shoulders. And he moved her hair aside, and his lips found the back of her neck. She inhaled. His hands moved with the same methodical attentiveness he brought to everything he cared about. And she understood that was what this was for Caleb: attention, pure and focused, and entirely aimed at her. Jude had come off the wall. He moved to her left side, and when she turned to look at him, his expression was the most open. She'd seen at all the edges of him, still there, but something underneath them, visible now. Something that had been under ice and finally found enough heat. He cupped her jaw in his rough hand and looked at her for a moment before he did anything, the way he always looked before he acted, making sure. His thumb traced along her cheekbone, and she leaned into it. And something in his chest changed. She felt it, the quality of his breathing. Bo was the last. He moved close and took her hand and held it in both of his, and when she looked at him, his face was serious in a way it rarely was. He was not the youngest in this moment. He was just a man who was sure of what he felt and wanted her to know it. "Tell me what you want," he said, "and I'll give it to you." "Everything," she said. So they gave her everything. The bathhouse filled with warmth and the sound of breathing and the occasional hiss of water on the heating stones. The lamplight moved over the stone walls. Outside, the mountain was cold and dark and indifferent and enormous. And inside this room, the world was entirely different, small and warm, and absolutely theirs. They moved around her and with her, without confusion, without collision, with the same wordless coordination they used on the trail and at the fence line and in a mercenary camp in the dark. It was not a planned thing. It emerged from the same understanding that had developed between all five of them over the last month, the understanding that this was not about claiming or competing. It was about tending, taking turns and working together, attending to her with the seriousness of men who had spent their whole lives learning what it meant to actually care for something. Gideon was careful with her. His hands were strong and warm, and they never went anywhere without first making intended to go, giving her time to want it. And the thing about Gideon was that he always knew when she did. He'd spent years reading landscape for intent. He read her the same way exactly, and without vanity about what he found. Caleb was thorough. The word that kept coming to Eva's mind was thorough, the way he was thorough with the herb bundles, with the burn salve, with the fence posts, with everything he decided deserved his attention. Nothing was skipped. Nothing was hurried. He paid attention to what made her breath catch, and he returned to it. And the patience in him was not a performance, but a genuine quality of character. Jude surprised her. She'd expected something harder from him, something with the same edges as his silence. But under his hands, she found a gentleness that was not in contradiction with his toughness. It was produced by it, by a man who knew how much force existed in himself, and therefore chose to hold it carefully. He was gentle the way a man is gentle, when gentleness costs him something. It meant more. Bo paid attention to her face. More than the others, his eyes came back to hers, checking, reading, present. He was young, but he wasn't untutored in the ways that mattered. He had spent his life in attunement with living things that couldn't speak, and he applied that gift to her. He knew before she said it. He often knew before she'd fully recognized it herself. She gave herself entirely to all of it. Not recklessly, she was not a reckless person, but completely, which is different. She chose this with the same deliberateness she'd brought to every choice that had led her here. From the advertisement she'd answered, to the warrant she'd contested, to the camp she'd walked into, in the dark. She chose it knowing who these men were, what they valued, what they'd promised and kept, and that was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the largest thing. Afterward, the room was quiet. The fire in the brazier had burned lower, casting a deep amber light across the stone walls. Eva was wrapped in the wool blanket someone had produced, and she had no memory of asking for. And she was warm through to the bone, in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Gideon was beside her, his back against the wall, not speaking. She could feel the steadiness of him, the same quality that had been there in the depot at Cottonwood, when he'd looked at Daltrey and said, "A woman isn't property." It had not changed. If anything, here in the quiet, it was more apparent. "You're not going to make this into something it isn't," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," he said. "And neither are you," she said to the room. Caleb, who was sitting on the bench with his bandaged arm resting on his knee, said, "No." Jude, against the wall with his eyes open and his face finally at rest, said nothing, which was his yes. Bo, cross-legged on the floor with his chin on his hand, said, "I wouldn't know how." She laughed. It came out low and warm and entirely genuine. Bo smiled at it, the unguarded smile of someone genuinely pleased to have caused a good thing. She looked at the ceiling of the bathhouse, at the stone overhead that had been here longer than any of them, and would be here long after. The ranch was standing. The men were here. The names Gideon had written down would reach federal marshals before the week was out. Harrison Alcott was running out of moves. And she was here, exactly where she'd chosen to be, on terms she'd negotiated herself, in a life that was entirely and completely hers. Her mother had said, "The point isn't to be free from something. The point is to be free for something." Eva finally understood in full what she'd meant. Morning came in slow and gray through the bathhouse window, and Eva was the first one awake. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory. The fire in the brazier had gone to coals. The room was cooler, but not cold, the stone walls still giving back the warmth they'd absorbed through the night. Gideon was asleep against the wall to her left, his breathing long and even, his face in sleep stripped of its usual vigilance, and looking, for the first time since she'd known him, simply at rest. Caleb was on the bench, his bandaged arm laid careful across his knee, his head tipped back. Jude had moved at some point in the night to the floor near the door, his coat pulled over him, his face turned toward the wall. Bo was the only one who'd taken a blanket, which she could have predicted. She got up without waking any of them. She wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders, found her dress on the peg near the door, and dressed quietly. She pushed the bathhouse door open and stepped into the morning. The yard was white and still. The sky was the color of pewter, low and flat, promising more snow before noon. The ruins of the smithy were a black shape against all that white, still faintly smoking at the center, where the heat was deepest. She stood on the stone step and looked at it for a long moment. Then she went inside and made coffee. She built the fire in the range, up from coals, filled the pot, and stood at the kitchen window while it came to heat. The Rockies were invisible this morning, wrapped in cloud. The yard was empty. Her horse, the bay she'd taken from the mercenary camp, was in the south tree line, where Bo had staked the animals the night before, standing with its head down in the patient way. Horses wait out weather. She heard the bathhouse door, and then boots on the porch steps, and Gideon came in. He looked at her, and looked at the coffee pot, and sat down at the table without speaking, which she'd come to understand was his particular form of gratitude for mornings that didn't require him to be alert yet. She put a cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it. She sat across from him. They drank coffee in the morning quiet, and it wasn't awkward. She'd wondered if it would be. It wasn't. It felt like every other morning at this table, which was either a sign of how deeply she'd settled into this place, or a sign of how genuinely these men were, who they'd shown themselves to be. She thought it was probably both. "We need to talk about what comes next," she said. Gideon looked at her over his cup. "Alcott, he's not done." Last night was a significant failure. For him, he'll recalibrate. He'll come back through legal channels, which is what he should have done to begin with, and didn't, because he thought faster was better. She curled her hands around her cup. He was wrong about that. But a proper warrant, correctly sealed and filed in the right jurisdiction, would create real problems. How do we stop it before it starts? We get to a federal marshal first. With Garrett's testimony and the names of the contracting firm, we have enough to open an investigation into Alcott for attempted kidnapping, destruction of property, and conspiracy. Once a federal investigation opens, any warrant he files gets scrutinized a great deal more carefully. She paused. And I file a counter affidavit in my own name, stating everything, starting with the arranged marriage and ending with the fire. Gideon nodded slowly. I'll ride to the federal marshal's office in Denver. We will, she said. He looked at her. I'm the primary witness, she said. My testimony is worth more than yours. And I've been waiting my whole life to walk into a government office and be taken seriously. I'm not missing that. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Close. Caleb came in while they were still on their first cups. Then Bo, who went directly to the bread tin and cut 4 slices without asking anyone. Jude was last, his hair damp from the water trough outside, looking more settled than she'd seen him in weeks. He sat in his usual chair and accepted the coffee Bo put in front of him and turned the cup in his hands and said nothing. And that particular silence had none of its old edges. Eva looked at the 4 of them around the table. She had been thinking, on and off, about what needed to be said, about what last night meant and what it didn't mean, and how 5 adults with good sense and genuine respect for one another navigated a territory that had no maps, because most people never went there. I want to say something, she said. They looked at her. I don't regret last night. I went into it with both eyes open, and I'd do it again. She set her cup down, but I'm not a prize. I'm not a question any of you gets to answer for me or about me. Whatever this is, whatever we are to each other, it doesn't change that I belong to myself. First, it never will. Nobody argued. Nobody looked surprised. Caleb nodded once, brief and certain. Bo looked at his bread. Jude looked at the table in the particular way of a man filing something important. Gideon said, "That was never in question." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway, because some things need to be said out loud." A pause. Then Bo, without looking up from his bread. "Are we going to talk about the legal part?" "What legal part?" she said. He glanced up. "The part where it's 1,881, and the law doesn't know what to do with a woman who belongs to herself." It was the most direct she'd heard him be about anything that wasn't a horse. She looked at him with something that was appreciation and also surprise. Caleb leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "There's a practical problem. Property rights. Legal standing in court. A single woman can own property in Colorado since '74, which helps. But without a recognized legal relationship, there are limits on what Eva can contest and what she can protect." He looked at her steadily. "The question of whose name goes on a deed, whose name goes on a marriage certificate, those aren't romantic questions. They're structural ones," Jude said. From his corner, "One of us files as her husband on paper and it's done." "No," Eva said. The word landed clean and flat and final. She looked at each of them in turn. "I appreciate the impulse. I do, but I'm not solving a legal problem by attaching my name to a man's. That's the same structure I left Virginia, to get away from a woman's legal existence running through her husband, like water through a pipe." She shook her head. "I will not do that, not even as a convenience, not even with people I trust." "Then how?" Bo asked. "I don't need a man's name on a piece of paper to validate my place here or prove I belong to this mountain," she said. "We are equal partners in this life, or we are nothing." Silence. Then Caleb said quietly, "The quartz mine." Everyone looked at him. "There's a quartz deposit under the north section of the property. Gideon's had it surveyed twice. We haven't filed the claim because we haven't had time and it hasn't been urgent." He looked at Eva. "File it in your name. The mine, the claim, the registration. It goes on record as Evangeline Mercer's property. That gives you legal standing in this county. That has nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with ownership. Eva went still. She looked at Caleb for a long moment, at the precise, unhurried logic of it, not a workaround, not a compromise, but a genuine solution that gave her something real and hers. He'd thought about it, not in the last 5 minutes. He'd thought about it before. "When did you think of that?" she asked. "About 2 weeks after you arrived," he said. "I didn't say anything because you hadn't asked. It wasn't my place to offer before you needed it." She understood that. She understood it exactly, the particular respect of seeing what someone might need and waiting for them to decide they wanted it rather than pressing it on them. "Yes," she said. "We file it in my name." Gideon nodded. "I'll get the survey documents. After Denver," she said. "After Denver." She picked up her cup and finished her coffee. Outside, the snow had started again, fine and steady, filling in the tracks they'd made in the night. The black ruins of the smithy disappeared under white. The mountains were still invisible in the clouds, but she could feel them there, the weight and permanence of them, the way the whole ridge sat solid under her feet. Bo was looking at the smithy ruins through the window. "We'll rebuild it," he said. Not a question, just a thing that was going to happen. "Stone this time," Jude said. "Stone," Caleb agreed. Gideon drank his coffee and said nothing because he was already planning it, and they all knew it, and that was enough. Eva got up to make breakfast, not because it was her job and not because anyone expected it, because she was hungry, and the skillet was right there, and cooking was something she'd always found clarifying the concrete task of it, the cause and effect. She sliced salt pork and put it in the pan, and it hissed and filled the kitchen with heat and smell. And behind her, she heard Jude get up and begin filling the water pot for the range without being asked. And Bo put plates on the table, and Caleb moved the lamp to make more room. And Gideon sat in the middle of all of it, like bedrock. 5 people in a kitchen on a snowy morning, making breakfast. She thought about her mother in the kitchen in Virginia, teaching law at the table while the biscuits were in the oven, because she believed education and daily life were not separate categories. She thought about how her mother had said, "The point isn't to be free from something. The point is to be free for something." She was free for this, for the salt pork and the snow and the coffee and the 4 men who had never once, not for a single day, made her feel like a guest in her own life. She put the food on the table, and they ate, and outside the Rockies waited under their blanket of cloud, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the happiness of 5 people in a log house at Red Ridge Pass, which was fine, because the 5 people didn't need the mountains to care. They only needed each other. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The federal marshal's name was Aldous Crane, and he had the particular face of a man who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. He listened to Eva for 45 minutes without interrupting. She sat across from him in the marshal's office in Denver with the fraudulent warrant, the names Garrett had given them, Caleb's written legal summary, and her own prepared statement, 8 pages in her own hand, precise and chronological, beginning with the arranged marriage and ending with the fire. She'd written it at the kitchen table on the night before they rode out, Gideon sitting across from her, reading a survey document and not saying anything while she worked, which was the exact kind of company she needed. Crane read everything she put in front of him. He read it carefully, the way a man reads when he intends to act on what he reads. When he finished, he set the papers flat on his desk and looked at her. "Harrison Alcott," he said. "Yes, of Philadelphia, yes. Connected to the Alcott-Briggs Railroad Syndicate that's been acquiring land rights across eastern Colorado for the past 2 years." Eva had not known that last part. She kept her face level. "I wasn't aware of the railroad connection." "We were," Crane said. "We've had complaints from 3 counties. Land seizures, suspicious fires, one homesteader family that filed a report and then withdrew it 2 weeks later under circumstances that concern us." He folded his hands. Your testimony, combined with the names you've brought me, opens this considerably wider than a personal grievance. Good, Eva said. Crane looked at her steadily. Miss Mercer, what you've described the ambush, the fire, the contracted mercenaries constitutes federal offenses. This will move into federal jurisdiction. You understand what that means for your situation. It means Alcott's warrant becomes a liability for him, rather than a tool against me, she said. It means any further legal action he takes will be examined in the context of an active federal investigation. And it means I have standing as a cooperating witness, which gives me considerably more legal protection than I had yesterday. Crane looked at her for a moment, longer than strictly necessary. Where did you study law? I didn't, she said. My mother taught me. He nodded once, the nod of a man adjusting an assumption. We'll need a full deposition. 2 days, possibly 3. I have time. She was back at Hawthorne Ridge by Thursday. Gideon was waiting in the yard when she rode in. He'd heard the horse, probably, from wherever he'd been working. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard and looked at her face when she dismounted, reading what was there. Good? He asked. Federal investigation. Active warrant for Alcott's arrest, pending the deposition review. She handed him the reins. He knows by now, which means he moves fast or he runs. He won't run, Gideon said. His kind never run, they spend. She'd thought the same thing on the ride back. Men like Harrison Alcott didn't understand retreat. They understood escalation. Losing meant applying more resources to win, because they'd never genuinely considered that they could lose. It was a structural failure of imagination, and it was going to bring him up the mountain. One more time, and she'd known it before she left Denver, and she'd planned for it. She'd told Crane as much, he'd agreed. They'd made arrangements. She walked into the house and found Caleb at the table, with a map of the gorge spread out in front of him and 2 pages of notes he'd made while she was gone. He looked up. The quarry, he said. North section, where the quartz deposit runs. The access trail from the east comes through Red Ridge Gorge. 30 feet of sheer rock on both sides, maybe 200 yards of exposed passage. She looked at the map. Alcott's men would have to come through there to reach the property from the valley road. It's the only direct route. It's also where we have 3 years' worth of quarry excavation charges stored in the rock face, positioned for controlled blasting. He tapped a point on the map. Gideon surveyed the placement last fall. They're set for downhill detonation, away from the house, into the gorge itself. She looked at him. You've been planning this. I've been thinking about the terrain, he said. There's a difference. There wasn't much of one in this case, but she let it go because the thinking was good, and the difference didn't matter. She spread her own notes next to his map, and they worked through the afternoon. And by the time Gideon came in, and Jude came down from the North Ridge, and Bo finished with the horses, the plan was complete. They came on a Saturday, 2 days later. In the early afternoon, 19 men. Alcott had apparently decided that the previous approach had suffered from insufficient scale. He came with a private force, not mercenaries this time, but something more organized, a hired company with matching coats and a coordinated advance that indicated actual military structure somewhere in their recent history. They came up the valley road from the south in 2 groups, one moving toward the gorge approach, one swinging wide to the west to come around the back of the ridge. Jude had been watching from the high point since dawn. He came down fast. 19. Split approach. Gorge and West Ridge. How long? Gideon asked. Gorge group reaches the passage in 40 minutes. West group slower. They're moving through deep snow on the ridge, maybe an hour, then we have 40 minutes. Eva was already at the stairs. She went up to the 2nd floor, through the hall to the ladder that accessed the upper loft, and climbed. The loft was a storage space that ran the full length of the house under the roofline, low-ceilinged, warm from the heat rising from below, with a narrow window at the south end that had been cut for ventilation, and happened to provide a direct sightline down the approach to the gorge. She sat up at the window with the Winchester and 2 boxes of ammunition and her back against the wall and waited. Below her, she could hear the house organizing itself. Gideon outside, positioning. Jude moving north to coordinate the timing on the quarry charges. Bo to the barn to move the horses further into the trees. Caleb at the back of the house, handling the second detonation line, the one for the West Ridge approach. The backup, in case the gorge didn't stop the second group. She'd argued against being the one in the loft. Gideon had said, with his habitual plainness, "You're the best shot on this property." That was a fact, not a compliment, and she accepted it and climbed the ladder. She watched through the narrow window as the gorge approach came into view below. The land dropped sharply on both sides of the ridge trail, funneling toward the 200-yard passage between the rock walls. She could see the line of men coming up the valley road, 20 yards between them. Disciplined spacing, moving fast. She found the leader. There was always a leader. You could tell by the position, not necessarily in front, but the fixed point that the others oriented around. This one was on a black horse, midway through the column, riding with the relaxed authority of someone who'd done this many times before. She tracked him through the window, 40 yards from the gorge entrance, 30. She pressed the stock to her shoulder and steadied her breathing. Jude was at the detonation point on the east face of the gorge. She'd told him to wait for her shot. The shot was the signal. 20 yards. She fired. Not at the leader. She put the first shot into the rock face at the gorge entrance. 6 feet off the ground, a crack of impact that echoed up the rock walls like a cannon and stopped the entire column cold. Jude detonated. The blast came from the east face, low and controlled, designed to bring down the rock shelf that overhung the gorge passage, the same shelf that Gideon had identified in his survey as unstable, and had been planning to clear before winter made it dangerous. It came down in a single rolling collapse, not an explosion, but a thunder of stone hitting stone that went on for 4 full seconds and filled the gorge with dust and rubble and a wall of noise that pushed across the valley like a wave. The column broke. Horses bolted, men scattered. The leader fought his black horse in a tight circle, trying to see through the dust, trying to understand what had just happened. The gorge passage was buried under 6 feet of rock. There was no way through. Eva watched from the loft the Winchester, but she didn't fire again. She watched the leader pull his horse around and look up the ridge toward the house. And she knew he was calculating, running the numbers. 19 men, a blocked approach, and whatever was happening on the West Ridge. What was happening on the West Ridge was Caleb. She heard the second detonation, smaller, more directed, and knew, from the timing, that it had gone where Caleb had placed it, a controlled charge, positioned to bring down a section of the ice-slick trail that was the only viable ascent for the West group. Not injure anyone, just close the road. She heard it close. Then she heard nothing from the west for a long time, which meant the West group had turned around. The leader on the black horse sat very still in the valley below and looked at the ridge and looked at the blocked gorge and looked at his column of scattered men. And Eva watched his Caucasian complete self in the set of his shoulders. He turned south. She watched until the last rider went back around the bend in the valley road, and the sound of hooves went away down the mountain. Then she put the Winchester down and sat with her back against the loft wall and let her hands shake for about 30 seconds, which she'd been deferring through sustained effort, and when the 30 seconds were up, she picked the rifle up and went down the ladder. Gideon was in the main room when she came down. He looked at her the same way he always looked at her, after a hard thing straight on, taking full account. "They're gone," she said. "West Group 2? "Yes," he exhaled slowly through his nose. "Alcott, he'll have heard from Denver by now. He knows federal marshals have opened an investigation." She set the Winchester on the table. "He's out of legitimate moves, and his hired moves just failed. He has no approach left. He has a courtroom." "Yes," she said, "he does. And so do I." Jude came in from the back, snow on his shoulders. His expression, the settled blankness of someone who's done a hard thing and filed it away. He looked at Eva, then at Gideon, then said, "Gorge is clear. Nobody got under the rockfall." "Good," Gideon said. Caleb came in next, both hands clean, coat dusted with stone powder. He looked at his notes where he'd left them on the table, like he was confirming something he'd already expected. Then he looked at Eva. "The West Group?" "Gone," she said. He nodded. "Federal marshals will reach them on the Valley Road if Crane sent his riders on schedule." He had. She knew he had, because she'd been specific with Crane about timing. And Crane was a man who understood the value of precision. Bo came in last, stamping snow off his boots, and his face, when he looked at all of them, assembled in the main room, was the face of someone who has been running on adrenaline and is now experiencing what comes after. He sat down hard in the nearest chair. "That," he said, "was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life." Jude said, without inflection, "You're 22. The loudest thing, Jude." The room went quiet. Then Caleb made a sound that was most of a laugh, brief and genuine, and that was the thing that broke the tension, not a declaration or a celebration. But Caleb, of all people, genuinely amused, and the unexpectedness of it cracked the room open. Gideon pulled back a chair and sat down, and the exhaustion in him was finally visible. The real kind that comes after sustained focus releases its grip. Eva sat beside him. Jude took the far chair. Caleb stood at the sideboard and poured 5 cups of water from the pitcher and put them on the table without ceremony. They sat in the room that smelled like coffee and pine smoke, and 2 days of sustained tension finally running out, and nobody said anything for a while, and that was exactly right. Eva looked at the table, at the map still spread across it, Caleb's notes beside it, the marks they'd made together, at the 5 cups of water, at 4 men who had fought for this mountain and this life without ever once expecting her to stay out of the fighting. Harrison Alcott had set 19 men and a blocked road and a fraudulent warrant and a fire. He had not sent enough. Spring came to Red Ridge Pass in the 2nd week of April, and it came the way mountain spring always does, not gradually, but all at once. A morning that arrived 20 degrees warmer than the one before it, with water running off every surface, and the snow retreating up the slope like it had somewhere better to be. Eva was at the writing table when the light changed. She'd been working on the school charter since February, revising it through 3 drafts, getting it precise. Colorado law allowed for the establishment of private educational institutions under a relatively uncomplicated charter process, and she'd been through the relevant statutes. Twice her mother's law primer, supplemented now by 2 additional volumes Caleb had ordered from a Denver bookseller in January, arriving packed in oilcloth on a supply rider in the dead cold of February. The charter named the institution the Valley Learning House. It named Evangeline Mercer as its founder and primary instructor. It outlined the curriculum: reading, writing, arithmetic, basic legal literacy, civil rights, and at Bo's suggestion, which she'd agreed was exactly right, land management and agricultural science. It was, in her careful assessment, the best document she'd ever written. She put down her pen and looked out the window at the April morning, at the yard running with snowmelt, and the aspens showing the first pale green of new leaves, and the mountains going from winter gray to something warmer, the light changing quality above the tree line. The quartz mine claim had been filed in her name in February. Evangeline Ann Mercer, sole registrant, Larimer County Record. It had gone through without incident, partly because Caleb had prepared the filing with characteristic precision, and partly because the federal investigation into Harrison Alcott had, by that point, absorbed most of the legal energy in the territory into its own considerable gravity. Alcott had not come back to Colorado. Federal marshals had reached him in Philadelphia in January, accompanied by enough documented evidence of conspiracy, land fraud, and contracted violence to ensure that whatever Harrison Alcott's future held, it did not include further expeditions west. His intermediary, the man who'd hired Garrett's firm, had cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. The contracting firm had lost its license. Garrett himself had provided a complete written account of his employment, which had been Crane's most useful piece of evidence, and which Gideon had anticipated from the beginning, which was why he'd sent Garrett south on foot instead of doing anything else with him. Marshal Crane had sent Eva a formal written acknowledgement of her cooperation and a copy of the arrest warrant for Alcott. She'd framed neither of them. She'd read them, filed them in the leather document case Caleb had given her, and gone back to work on the school charter. Some victories don't need to be mounted on the wall. She heard the hammer ring from the far side of the yard, the rhythm of stonework, which had been the sound of Hawthorne Ridge since January. The new smithy was going up, stone this time, as Jude had said, on a foundation 2 feet thick with an iron-reinforced doorframe and a roof of slate that had come up from the valley on 3 separate supply trips. It was going to be the most solid structure on the property by the time it was done, and the building of it had the particular satisfaction of a thing being made better than it was before. Jude was doing most of the stonework. He'd discovered, or rediscovered, that cutting and setting stone suited him in a way that range work didn't quite, and he'd been at it since the ground thawed, with a focus that cleared out whatever had been accumulating behind his eyes since Eva had known him. She didn't have a theory about why masonry worked for Jude. She only knew that it did, and she'd watched him carefully over the last 2 months find something in the weight and precision of stone that settled him in a way words hadn't. She understood that. Some things you don't talk yourself into. You work your way there. She picked up the charter and went downstairs. Caleb was at the table with his inventory. Spread in front of him, the spring herbs were coming in, and he'd been cataloging what had survived the winter stock and what needed replacing. He looked up when she set the charter in front of him. "Final draft," she said. He put his inventory aside and read it. He read all 8 pages with the same unhurried attention he gave everything, making 2 small marks in the margin with a pencil where language could be tightened. "These," he said. She looked at both marks. He was right on both counts. She took the pages back and made the edits at the table while he returned to his inventory, and when she was done, she handed it back and he read it again and nodded. "File it this week," he said. "Ground's thawed enough that the valley road is passable. I'm riding down Thursday. Bo's coming to pick up the window glass for the schoolhouse. I'll have a list for the apothecary." She put the charter in the document case. Gideon came in from outside, with his hands dusted from something, and poured himself water from the pitcher and stood at the window, looking at the yard. "Jude's got the south wall to the window height," he said. "He's fast," Eva said. "He's been getting up before me." Gideon said it with the mild note of a man who is not accustomed to being second awake. First time in 32 years, she almost smiled. "The stonework is good for him." "Yes." He drank his water and looked at the aspens through the window. "He doesn't say much, but I've known him long enough to know the difference between him not talking because he's closed and him not talking because he doesn't need to be." He set the cup down. "He's the second one." That was, for Gideon, a long speech about feelings. She accepted it accordingly. Bo appeared in the doorway in the early afternoon with dirt on his hands and the particular brightness of someone who's been outdoors for 4 hours and is entirely fine with that. "The valley floor is green," he said, like this was news he'd been saving. "It's April," Caleb said. "It's green, Caleb." Eva looked up from the letter she was writing, anning an inquiry to the Denver Teachers College about materials and methodologies, which she'd drafted twice already. "How far down did you go?" "Far enough to see it. The creek's running full. The lower meadow is clear." He came to the table and looked over her shoulder at the letter. "Is that for the school?" "For resources. There are newer reading methods being developed in the East. If I can get the materials, I want to use them." He was quiet for a moment. She knew what he was thinking about. Page 47 of A History of the American West, which he'd since finished the whole book, working through it steadily over 3 months, at their kitchen table, with the lamp between them, with a set of techniques that had taken his scattered letter patterns and given them enough structure to hold. He'd read her the last page aloud. She'd listened. He'd closed the book and sat with it for a minute, and she'd let him have that minute without filling it. There are other kids like me, he said now, in the valley. I know 2 of them. I know, she said. They're on my list. He smiled, went to find the coffee. The schoolhouse went up in 3 weeks in May. It was not large. 1 room, 1 door, 4 windows for light, a wood stove, and 20 feet of blackboard that Caleb had sourced from a surplus supply house in Denver. And Gideon had hauled up the mountain in sections on the freight sled. The desks were made from the same hand-hewn lumber as the main house, built by Jude in the evenings, after the smithy work was done, finished smooth, because he understood that children spend a lot of hours at desks, and rough wood is unkind to small arms. Eva built the bookshelves herself. It took her 2 days and Caleb's level and more patience than she'd expected, and when it was done, it was straight and solid, and exactly what she wanted. She filled it with everything she had. The law primer, the 2 new legal volumes. Caleb's copy of his medicinal notebook, he'd made her a clean second copy through the winter months, every page in his careful hand. 3 mathematics texts, a collection of essays on civil rights that had been published in a Chicago journal and found its way to Red Ridge through the same bookseller who'd sent the legal volumes. A natural history of the Colorado Rockies. 5 novels, a primer on land law. She stood in front of the full shelves on the afternoon before the school opened and looked at them for a long time. Her mother had taught in a kitchen. She had a room with 4 windows and 20 feet of blackboard and a door that opened to the mountain. The first class was 9 students. 2 from the Aldred family. Clara was still 3 and too young, but her brother Owen was 7 now, and he came with his hands scrubbed and a serious expression that reminded Eva of Caleb. A pair of brothers from the Erickson homestead, 2 miles down the valley, 7 and 9, both starting from 0. An 11-year-old girl named Dorothea, whose family had come from Saxony 3 years ago, and who spoke better English than she knew she did. 2 children from the Ute settlement at the base of the pass, a boy of 10 named Running Horse, who'd asked specifically to learn to read English, and his younger sister who came, said nothing, watched everything, and could already do sums in her head, faster than Eva could track on the blackboard. And 2 adult women, a homesteader's wife named Ruth, who was 34 and had never had schooling and wanted to understand contracts before she signed any more of them, and an immigrant woman named Maria from Sonora who wanted her children to learn and had decided the best way to ensure that was to learn alongside them. Eva stood in front of the room on the first morning and looked at her 9 students. She thought about the right thing to say at the beginning. She said, "Everything you learn in this room belongs to you. Not to me, not to your parents, not to any government or church or employer. Knowledge is the one thing that can't be taken from you once you have it. That's why we're here." Ruth, the homesteader's wife, wrote that down in her new notebook, word for word. That evening, Eva sat on the front porch of the main house and watched the sun go down behind the western peaks. The light went gold and then orange and then a deep rose that stained the snowfields on the high ridges pink. And then it was gone, and the stars came out, 1 and then a dozen, and then the whole impossible dense blanket of them that the Rockies offered on a clear May night. Gideon came out and sat beside her. Then Caleb, who brought 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Eva without asking and kept one for himself, and stood at the porch rail looking at the last light. Jude came out last and leaned against the post with his arms folded and his face turned up to the stars. And he looked at them the way he'd looked at the new smithy walls last week, like he'd built something that was going to hold. Bo had brought a chair out from inside, and turned it backwards and sat with his chin on his arms. On the top rail, watching the ridge go dark. They stayed like that as the stars got brighter and the air got cold, and the pines made their sound in the small night wind. The mine claim was on record. The school charter was filed. The federal investigation was running its course. The smithy walls were at roof height. The school had 9 students and 2 shelves of books and a stove that needed a damper adjustment, but otherwise worked. She'd come here in November with 1 carpet bag, a Winchester, and an advertisement, soft at the creases. She looked out at what 4 months had built. "Bo," she said. What did Running Horse think of the mathematics?" Bo turned his head. He said it was the same as tracking. Pattern recognition, different symbols. "He's right," she said. "That's exactly what it is." Bo smiled at the dark. "He's 10. I didn't figure that out until you just said it. That's what school is for," she said. Caleb looked over from the rail. "You're going to need a second room by fall." "I know." She'd been thinking about it since Tuesday, Jude. Jude looked at her without shifting his weight off the post. "Don't," he said. "Obviously," she said. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved by the same fraction it always did when something landed right. Gideon had his coffee cup in both hands, and he was looking at the mountains, the dark shapes of them against the starred sky. And he had the expression of a man who is exactly where he belongs and knows it and doesn't need to say so. She sat beside him and looked at the same sky and felt the same thing. Her mother had said, "The point isn't to be free from something. The point is to be free for something." Eva Mercer was free for all of it. For the school and the mine claim and the second room they'd build in the fall. For the kitchen table where someone was always working on something and the coffee was always on. And the law primer sat beside the medicinal notebook. And nobody thought there was anything unusual about that. For 4 men who had shown her not in speeches, but in the daily accumulated evidence of their lives, that strength and gentleness are not opposites, and that respect is not a concession, but a foundation. For the mountain, which did not care about her, and therefore asked nothing of her, and gave her everything anyway, the cold air, and the clean water, and the stone that held heat, and gave it back slowly, and the stars overhead, that were the same stars her mother had looked at from a kitchen in Virginia and seen freedom in. She was free, not from something. For all of this, the stars burned white over Red Ridge Pass, and the pines moved in the dark, and the 5 of them sat on the porch of the house they'd built and defended, and were still building, and the night was cold, and the coffee was warm, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was home. So what do we take away from Eva Mercer's story? From a woman who arrived at Hawthorne Ridge with nothing but a carpet bag, a rifle, and a folded advertisement, and left it having built a school, filed a claim in her own name, and found a home that never once asked her to shrink herself to belong? Maybe it's this. Freedom was never about running away from something. It was about running towards something worth building. Eva didn't find safety at Hawthorne Ridge because 4 strong men decided to protect her. She found it because they respected her enough to let her protect herself. Gideon never once tried to speak for her. Caleb didn't hand her a plan. He handed her a notebook and let her write her own. Jude taught her to move through the wilderness instead of carrying her through it. And Bo, the one everyone underestimated, reminded her, and us, that being seen for who you actually are is sometimes the rarest gift another person can give. There's a quiet lesson buried in the bathhouse scene, in the quartz mine filed under her own name, in the moment she looked at 4 men who loved her and said, "I belong to myself first." That's not a rejection of love. It's the foundation real love is built on. A partnership, whether romantic, familial, or simply human, only means something when both sides walk into it whole, not when one person disappears into the other. And then there's her mother's words, echoing through the whole story like a heartbeat. The point isn't to be free from something. The point is to be free for something. That single idea reframes Everything Eva goes through the fraudulent warrant, the ambush at Blood Pass, the battle at Red Ridge Gorge. None of it was really about escaping Harrison Alcott. It was about becoming someone capable of building a life, a school, a home, a family of her own choosing, brick by brick, page by page, fence post by fence post. Maybe that's the real heart of every good Western, not the gunfights or the mountains, but the idea that the frontier was never just a place. It was a chance to become someone new, on your own terms, surrounded by people who let you. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or reminded you of someone in your own life who taught you that strength and gentleness were never opposites, let us know in the comments. And if you'd like more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe, because there are many more journeys across the frontier still waiting to be told. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, incidents, and events depicted are the product of imagination and are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to actual events is purely coincidental. This content is intended for mature audiences and includes fictional depictions of romance and intimacy between consenting adult characters. Viewer discretion is advised.